Racist policewoman points gun at black woman. Panics when sheriff arrives and bows to her. Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories. The supermarket buzzed with soft chatter and the occasional squeak of rolling carts. But the calm was shattered by a sharp, commanding voice. Hey, old lady. Stand still. Startled. Margaret Harris, a black woman in her mid-50s dressed in slightly worn jeans, a pale slate blue t-shirt, and a thin, faded blouse, turned around, still holding a jar of paprika. Her expression was one of confused surprise, not fear. Her shopping cart held only a few modest items: bread, milk, canned tuna. Opposite her stood a young blonde police officer in full uniform, her name tag reading, Officer Jessica Monroe, though she looked more like she had stopped by after hours than on duty. Her hair was tied back neatly, her expression tense and sharp with suspicion. You mean me, officer? Margaret asked quietly, her voice calm but puzzled. Who else? Jessica shot back, her tone dripping with disdain as she strode closer, eyes scanning Margaret's simple clothes like they were evidence of a crime. What are you doing here? Lurking around like that? Trying to pocket something? The implication was clear, the prejudice laid bare. I'm just shopping, Margaret replied, her voice steady, firm. Like everyone else, please watch your language and be respectful. That simple assertion struck a nerve. Jessica's face twisted in anger at being corrected, especially by someone she viewed as beneath her. Respectful? You dare talk to me like that? She snapped, her voice rising, and then, in a flash of irrational rage, her hand dropped to her hip. The cold, metallic sound of her Glock being cocked rang out like a gunshot through the spice aisle. Gasps erupted, a jar shattered, the muzzle of the weapon rose and fixed squarely on Margaret's chest. Hands up, lean on that shelf or I'll shoot, Jessica barked, her finger trembling near the trigger. Panic rippled around them, phones came out, people scattered, and Margaret stood, still, calm, eyes locked on the gun, not with fear, but with the solemn gaze of someone who had seen worse. Slowly, she raised her hands, refusing to lean back, refusing to cower. A soldier's stance, a woman who'd faced death before. The air grew thick, almost too heavy to breathe. A storm was gathering in aisle 7. Margaret Harris stood firm in the center of the aisle, her hands raised just above her shoulders, palms open, not in surrender, but in control. Her spine was straight, her jaw set with quiet defiance as the cold barrel of Officer Monroe's Glock loomed inches from her chest. Around them, the once peaceful supermarket had transformed into a theater of fear, shoppers frozen behind displays of cereal boxes, wide-eyed children clinging to their parents, a ripple of panicked whispers replacing the usual hum of consumer life. Jessica Monroe's breath came in short, ragged bursts, her knuckles white around the grip of her weapon, her ego flaring red in her face. I told you to lean on that shelf, she hissed, but Margaret didn't move. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, studied the officer not as a frightened woman but as a trained strategist. She read the tremble in Monroe's hand, the flicker of uncertainty buried beneath the mask of rage. You are harassing me, officer, Margaret said, her voice low but resonant, cutting through the charged silence like a blade. Your conduct is not only unprofessional, it is unlawful. And it is dangerous. The words struck like flint. Jessica flinched, eyes darting to the bystanders, to the phone's recording, to the faces now seeing her not as a figure of law, but as the threat. You don't talk to me like that, she snapped, her voice rising again, desperate to reassert dominance. This is my jurisdiction, and people like you. She stopped short, choking on her own venom, but the intent was already out, hovering in the air like poison. Margaret didn't blink. You've made your judgment based on nothing but how I look, she said, each syllable steady as a heartbeat. And now you're pointing a weapon at an innocent woman. Tell me, officer, who here is really disturbing the peace? The question lingered like a thundercloud ready to break. Jessica's grip faltered, the aisle held its breath, and in that fragile, electric moment, the balance of power began to shift. Margaret's eyes never left the trembling barrel of the gun, but her voice cut through the tension like the steady toll of a bell. Officer Monroe, she said, reading the name tag with deliberate calm. What is your badge number? The question hung in the air like a challenge, disarming in its poise. Jessica blinked, thrown off balance. What? She stammered, her grip loosening ever so slightly. Your badge number, Margaret repeated, louder this time, her tone firmer, sterner. You're violating every standard of your duty. I will be filing a report and a phone call. Now. Jessica's laugh was sharp, ugly, laced with disbelief. You think calling someone's going to save you? She scoffed, glancing around, noticing the phone still pointed at her. Who are you calling? Your gang? Your lawyer? Margaret's expression didn't flinch. Sheriff Alan Brooks, she said plainly. He's a dear friend, since childhood. I have his personal number. The name hit Jessica like a slap. Her lips parted but no sound came. You're bluffing, she muttered, her bravado cracking. There's no way. Margaret's gaze intensified, firm and rooted. Then let me reach into my left pocket and prove it, she said quietly, or keep pointing that gun. And prepare to answer to the sheriff himself. Jessica hesitated, the panic rising fast now, curling cold around her spine. Do it slow, she barked, her voice faltering. Margaret nodded once, deliberate and measured, and reached into her coat pocket, pulling out an old flip phone, not a sleek weapon, just a battered tool. She held it up for all to see, pressed a button, and scrolled to a contact labeled simply, Alan B. One tap, the ringtone pierced the stillness. Once, twice, then a gravelly, authoritative voice broke through. Brooks speaking. Jessica froze, her entire body went still. Margaret's voice shifted instantly, no longer the voice of a civilian under threat, but one that commanded respect. Alan, it's Margaret. Silence. Then a sharp inhale from the other end. Jessica's blood drained from her face. She stared at Margaret in horror. Margaret Harris, this unassuming woman in a faded blouse, was Colonel Margaret Harris. The one the sheriff praised with reverence. The woman she had just aimed a loaded gun at. Officer Monroe stood paralyzed, the Glock in her hand now trembling uncontrollably. Her mouth slightly agape as the words, "It's Margaret," echoed like a death knell in her ears. The name didn't just carry weight, it detonated decades of history, respect, and reputation that shattered her delusions in an instant. Colonel Margaret Harris, the war hero, the hometown legend, the woman Sheriff Brooks often called his sister in arms. And here she was, calm, commanding, her cell phone still raised as if it were a badge more powerful than Monroe's own. The silence in the aisle grew dense, suffocating. Then suddenly, the doors of the supermarket burst open with a metallic crash, and in stormed Sheriff Alan Brooks, wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans but radiating raw fury. His eyes found Margaret first, scanned her quickly, and then zeroed in on Jessica Monroe, who stood like a child caught stealing, gun still drawn but her soul drained. "Monroe," he bellowed, his voice like thunder rolling through the fluorescent aisles. "What the hell have you done?" His steps were fast and heavy, shaking the tile beneath him as he marched down aisle 7 like a hammer of justice. Jessica stumbled backward, her hand loosening on the gun as she stammered. "Sheriff, I didn't know, it was all a mistake." A mistake? Brooks roared, eyes blazing. "You pulled a weapon on Colonel Harris. You aimed a loaded gun at a decorated veteran, an unarmed citizen, over what? Her clothes?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Hand over your weapon and badge. Right now." Jessica's lips quivered, tears spilled freely. "Please, Sheriff, I didn't mean." "Now," he shouted, and the force of it made her flinch like she'd been struck. She slowly removed her gun, handed it over with shaking fingers, then unpinned her badge with trembling hands. Brooks didn't even glance at her. "Sergeant Blake, Corporal Daniels," he barked. "Take her in, straight to internal affairs. No calls, no contact, no cover-ups." "Yes, sir," came the curt reply, as Monroe was led away, sobbing and broken, past the damning stares of the crowd. Margaret stood unmoving. She didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she simply watched, her face shadowed with sorrow, not for Monroe, but for the tragedy of a system still poisoned by arrogance and hate. As the automatic doors of the supermarket whispered shut behind Officer Monroe's escorted figure, a heavy silence lingered in her wake, thick with disbelief and simmering outrage. Sheriff Brooks remained still for a moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths, before turning to Margaret with eyes softened by remorse and fury barely restrained. "Margaret, are you all right?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. laced with a guilt no uniform could shield. Margaret gave a faint nod, her calm composure unbroken. "I'm fine, Alan. Just disappointed," she said, the weight of her words hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd shifted, from confusion and fear to rising anger. As the truth sank in, the woman they had watched stand so silently under the barrel of a gun was not just a victim, she was Colonel Harris. A symbol of valor, dignity, and grace. Sheriff Brooks gave a brief signal, and his officers moved swiftly, interviewing witnesses, gathering statements, retrieving every phone video, every angle of the chaos that had unfolded in Aisle 7. Gregory Miller, the store manager who had tried to intervene, was one of the first to offer his full account, his voice shaking but firm. The Internal Affairs Division moved with uncommon speed, launching a full investigation within the hour, as media trucks began circling like vultures outside. That night, in a windowless conference room at police headquarters, Sheriff Brooks read the preliminary findings with a clenched jaw. Officer Monroe's personnel file revealed more than just the chaos of today: formal warnings, quiet complaints, and patterns of bias that had been overlooked for too long. The evidence was damning: cell phone footage, witness testimonies, and the chilling image of a loaded Glock aimed at an unarmed citizen. There was no ambiguity, no excuse, no room left for institutional silence. Monroe hadn't just violated policy, she had betrayed her badge, her oath, and the trust of the community. Brooks signed the termination order without hesitation, the pen stroke heavy with resolve. He didn't just owe it to Margaret, he owed it to justice itself. The courtroom was packed, the air taut with expectation and quiet fury as the trial of former officer Jessica Monroe commenced under the stark fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge County Court. Reporters lined the benches, their pens twitching like coiled snakes. Community members filled every seat, their faces carved with anticipation and indignation. At the heart of it all stood Colonel Margaret Harris, poised and solemn in her neatly pressed uniform, minus the medals, her presence alone commanding reverence. When she took the stand, the courtroom fell utterly silent. With unwavering clarity, she recounted every detail: the words, the slurs, the cold click of the gun's chamber, the trembling barrel aimed at her heart. Her voice did not waver. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to truth. The prosecution, led by David Lang, delivered a case sharpened to a lethal edge, presenting irrefutable video evidence, corroborating testimonies from shoppers, the store manager, and damning records from Monroe's own disciplinary file. Each clip of Monroe's aggression, her slurred accusations, and the terrifying draw of her weapon played on the courtroom monitor like a horror reel. Met with stunned silence and shaken heads, the defense tried to soften the blow, painting Monroe as a stressed young officer, a struggling single mother, a woman overwhelmed, but the jury saw through it. Her tears in court did little to erase the sneer she wore in the footage, the venom of her words, or the reckless endangerment of an unarmed civilian. When the jury finally returned, their verdict was swift and certain: guilty on all counts, second-degree assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and official misconduct. Jessica Monroe crumbled at the declaration, her sobs echoing across the marble floor, while Margaret Harris remained seated, her eyes steady, her hands folded in silent resolution. Justice, slow but relentless, had finally spoken. The day of sentencing arrived beneath a gray sky that mirrored the weight inside the courthouse. Jessica Monroe stood trembling before Judge Samuel Keller, her face pale and streaked with tears, her once proud posture reduced to a hunched, desperate figure. Behind her, rows of silent spectators sat in breathless anticipation, while Margaret Harris, composed and resolute, watched from the front row, her presence a silent anchor in the storm. Judge Keller, stern and deliberate, read through the case file one final time before lifting his gaze. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his voice solemn, echoing through the still chamber, "you were entrusted with authority, with responsibility, with a badge that symbolized protection, not power. But you betrayed that trust. Not in haste or by accident, but with prejudice, pride, and a weapon drawn against an innocent woman." The room held its breath. Colonel Harris is not just a symbol of this city's courage, she is its conscience. And you aimed a loaded gun at her because of your bias. Because of her appearance, you escalated, You endangered, and you disgraced the uniform you wore. Jessica sobbed openly now, her shoulders shaking as Judge Keller continued. While the court recognizes your lack of prior convictions and personal struggles, it also recognizes the gravity of your offense, an act that shook public trust and very nearly cost a life. A long pause followed. Then the gavel fell in the judge's voice, clear and unrelenting. You are hereby sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Gasps filled the courtroom, some in relief, others in solemn reflection. Jessica's knees buckled slightly as the bailiffs moved in, the cold sound of handcuffs clicking shut behind her wrists. She was led away, her footsteps hollow against the tile. Margaret didn't speak. She didn't move. She simply watched as justice walked quietly out the door. Not in triumph, but in hard-won truth. The verdict sent tremors through Oak Ridge. Not just within the polished marble halls of justice, but deep into the heart of a community forced to confront its own reflection. The fall of Jessica Monroe became a reckoning, her uniform no longer a symbol of honor, but a cautionary tale about unchecked power and prejudice. In the days that followed, Sheriff Alan Brooks stood before the press, his voice steady, his eyes raw with resolve as he pledged sweeping reforms. Bias training became mandatory, not optional. Use of force protocols were rewritten, and every badge now bore a shadow of accountability. Background checks grew sharper, recruitment more rigorous, and body cam reviews relentless. No more silence, no more second chances for hate dressed in blue. Meanwhile, Colonel Margaret Harris returned to her quiet routines, not to fade into anonymity, but to lead by quiet example. She declined interviews, turned down invitations for television appearances, and chose instead to speak through action, mentoring young veterans, attending civic forums, sharing coffee and silent reflections with Sheriff Brooks at the same corner cafe they'd frequented for decades. Her name, once whispered with awe in military circles, now resonated through every aisle of that small-town supermarket, not because of the gun aimed at her heart, but because of the dignity with which she stood. Margaret had become more than a survivor, she had become a sentinel. A reminder that strength isn't in the weapon drawn, but in the grace that chooses restraint. Her story spread not in headlines, but in hearts. A legacy etched not in rage, but in courage. And as the seasons change, so did Oak Ridge, slowly, painfully, but undeniably, because one woman dared to stand when it would have been easier to kneel. True strength lies not in power, but in dignity, restraint, injustice. Prejudice, when left unchecked, can turn protectors into threats, but one voice of courage can shift the course of an entire community. Stand tall, speak truth, demand accountability. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. More powerful stories are on the way, because every voice deserves to be heard.